Thank you, Peter, for that gracious introduction, and thank you all for being here. This symposium has grown out of my experience here at Bard Graduate Center over the last 2 years. My time here has transformed the way I think about my own work and about the field of Islamic studies more generally by exposing me to the fascinating questions being asked about cultural history through objects by scholars working on widely ranging regions and periods. The premise of this institution is that objects can tell us things about the past that other sources do not, and that material culture represents an unparalleled font of knowledge about how humans interact with each other and with the world around them. Humans create and enliven the objects around them by crafting them, selling them, preserving them, or destroying them, and by using them. But the objects themselves, in their transformations and movements, also illuminate the social and cultural contexts in which they operate. This day is conceived as a chance to explore what objects can tell us about the Islamic world and about the practice of power in particular. We've assembled an interdisciplinary international group of scholars in the hopes that the conversation we begin here today can start a broader discussion about the role of material culture in studying the Islamic world. The origins of the Western study of the Arabo-Islamic world in the 18th century had philological roots, which valued learning the languages of the Near East for their connections to Christian history. Texts were seen as an end unto themselves, the source of knowledge and understanding, and were trusted as reliable and accurate depictions of the past. More recent scholarship has brought a critical approach to these texts, understanding them as constructed narratives that reflect contemporary concerns, and has also introduced new kinds of sources for historical knowledge, including visual and material artifacts. But the ways in which scholars work with these sources, written, visual, and material, varies according to discipline, and it is far too rare to find scholars from across disciplinary divides talking to each other about how they approach these materials. The material turn in the humanities, which brings a particular focus on materiality of historical evidence, from texts to art to everyday objects, offers intriguing possibilities to the study of the Islamic past. What happens when we look at sources, visual, material, or textual, as having their own meanings, their own logics, and their own stories? What does that tell us about the people who produced them or owned them and the culture they helped constitute? Objects, of course, range from the most valuable insignia of authority to the most quotidian potsherds and scraps of paper. So even within the study of the material world of Islam, there's wide variation in methodology and in conclusions. Power is a useful lens for understanding one aspect of how objects could function within the Islamic world because it limits our focus to the objects most highly valued by those who held or sought authority. Objects commissioned by, gifted to, or treasured by those in power were more likely to survive, more likely to be described in writing. They could also be imbued with particular meanings, connected to spiritual or temporal ideals, to magical elements or expressions of dominance or assimilation. Yet objects are not simply illustrations of ideals. They could be constitutive of power. As things that have power inhering in them, objects could shape the people they encountered, even as they were crafted by people. Perhaps the objects most clearly associated with political power in the Islamic world were the coins minted by rulers. Early Islamic coins were adaptations of pre-Islamic models, but by the time of the Umayyads, a characteristic form had been established that reflected new Islamic ideals. This form placed Arabic, and especially the Word of God, in a central position and largely displaced figurative coin traditions. Yet even within this mostly consistent use of Arabic inscriptions on stamped coinage exists exuberant variety in the texts chosen, in materials and weights, and in decorative elements. Minting coins, along with proclaiming one's name in the khutbah or Friday prayer, was the way of declaring oneself a ruler. Determining what to place on a coin thus consisted of a chance to argue one's vision of righteous authority in a medium that would be widely circulated. The coins that were produced in turn affected how subjects and rival or later rulers understood power and articulated it themselves. Even within the textual traditions of Islam, an eye toward objects reveals them at every turn. Chronicles report that the Fatimid caliphs won Dhul Fiqar, the sword of the Prophet Muhammad, from the Abbasids, and that this constituted a sign of their righteousness. In a subsequent sermon, the Fatimid Caliph al-Mansur called his father the inheritor of the sword of his ancestor. It's clear that objects like the Dhul-Fiqar were symbols of power, but they were more than that as well. They constituted and shaped power, both spiritual and temporal. Being the possessor of the sword of the prophet meant being the select of God, for he would not grant it to anyone unworthy. Understanding this object embedded in its networks of cultural significations shows that it is more than a sword, and the cultural significance it carries in turn reveals important lessons about the society that valued it so highly. Beyond simply mining texts for discussions of objects, I think it's also fruitful to consider texts as visual and material, a topic so thoughtfully explored in the Material Text Symposium last month here at the BGC, organized by my colleagues Sean Leatherbury and Andrew Morrill. Doing so can amplify or even undermine their linguistic meanings. How does the way a text is presented reflect its meaning? I'm thinking here of the fascinating work done by Marina Rostow about how Judeo-Arabic manuscripts in the Cairo Geniza addressed to the leaders of the community often mirrored the physical forms of petitions to the Fatimid Caliph, imbuing Jewish leaders with something of the power of the Caliph. If you look at their text, there's no indication of this, but if you look at the form of the writing itself and the way that it's laid out on the page, it's clear that it's modeled on Fatimid petitions. So these are a few elements of the ways that I think we can approach Islamic material culture fruitfully, but we'll hear much more and much more engagingly from the scholars who have come today. We'll begin with talks from 4 scholars whose approaches to Islamic material culture are particularly illuminating, from a range of institutions and working on a range of regions and periods, and they've all come from abroad. They'll each present their own work on power and objects in Islam from the perspective of their varied disciplines and focused on their own regions and periods. And after each talk, we'll have 15 minutes for questions. This afternoon, we'll have a round-table discussion about objects and texts, objects as texts, texts as objects, with 4 speakers talking about how to read texts and objects separately and together. I hope that all of the speakers today in our audience will engage with these questions in a lively discussion. Clifford Geertz famously argued that culture is only intelligible through a thick description of the webs of signification in which humans are suspended. My hope is that in bringing together this group of scholars, we may more thickly describe the glorious variety of political cultures in the medieval Islamic world. I'd like to thank Saran and Ravi Trehan, whose generosity has made this day possible. I would also like to thank the faculty, students, and staff of the BGC who've made my 2 years here so rich. Special thanks are due to the director, Dr. Susan Weber, to Dean Peter Miller, and to Dr. Mark LeBlanc and the events team for their support. So with that, I will turn to introducing our first speaker. Mariam Rosser Owen is the curator responsible for the Arab World collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She specializes in the Islamic Mediterranean, especially Al-Andalus and the Maghreb, and she has published research, curated exhibitions, and organized conferences on the material culture of the Islamic West and the Mediterranean. She completed her DPhil at the University of Oxford in 2002, and her most recent book was a co-edited volume entitled Metalwork and Material Culture in the Islamic World, Art, Craft, and Text, Essays Presented to James W. Allen, which came out in 2012. Today, she will be speaking to us about artistic patronage and political legitimacy, the case of the Umayyad regents of Al-Andalus, circa 970 to 1010, which is the subject of a book she is working on. Please join me in welcoming Mariam Rosser Owen.